At the end of the Subsistence 2 lecture, I generally talk a little bit about the reading, specifically Jared Diamond. That's Jared Diamond off to the left-hand side on this slide. Here I like to run through some of the observations that he made in his piece, The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race, and in relation to the video that we just saw and all the other things that we've been talking about. In case you didn't catch it, the worst mistake in the history of the human race, according to Jared Diamond, was the transition to intensive agriculture, the reliance on this new system. Excuse me. He's written a lot of books. Guns, Germs, and Steel is one that you might have run across. He wrote another book called Collapse, which was on the collapse of complex society. So he spent a lot of time analyzing this sort of thing. In this article, he was pointing out that while we're able to support produce a greater surplus, and we're able to support a very dense population. Right now, most of the world relies on intensive agriculture for its food production. He's pointing out that this is not necessarily the most stable system in the world, and he draws evidence from archaeological studies of early hunter-gatherers, archaeological and ethnological studies of hunter-gatherers, and archaeological studies of people who had recently transitioned to agriculture. And particularly he was interested in those ones that were successful for a period of time, flourished, and then they just collapsed. And that was the basis of his book Collapse, that he wrote much later on. In any case, there were some of the things that he found. He was making a comparison between those hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists. Some of the things that he noticed that were problems in early agriculture that led to the collapse of these cultures are listed to the right here. Right, so they had an overdependence on one crop early on. Took time, as you can imagine, to domesticate crops. They would domesticate crops one crop at a time, and so initially that could be very successful for a period of time. You could produce a lot more than you could get from hunting and gathering, certainly, and then something would happen. Right, you'd have a year that was too dry or too wet, or there was a disease or a pest or something that destroyed your whole crop, and then a lot of people would basically starve to death. Right, so that was that was one of the problems associated with early agriculture and led to the collapse of more than one civilization. Other problems were associated with population. The early agriculture, owing to the need for water mostly, were situated along rivers. And often the river ran through the middle of a city, and became a city. The settlement turned into a larger settlement, and that became a city. And the river would run right through the middle of the thing. They'd be using it for irrigation, but they'd also be using it for every other thing under the sun, including drinking water and wastewater and washing and all sorts of things. People who had recently been hunting and gathering were living in relatively small groups, and they were moving around regularly. They were not accustomed to, based on their evolution, their biological evolution, they were not accustomed to living in close quarters with other people on such a scale, and so diseases could easily rip through the populations. Disease was common, obviously, in these early cities. They didn't have sanitation measures, no sewage systems or anything like that, no running water. And so things like cholera and dysentery wiped out, or at least did a lot of damage to early civilizations, could have wiped it out, especially in conjunction with some of these other factors. Social stratification is another thing that's associated with the transition to intensive agriculture, particularly because there's a high degree of specialized labor. There's a definition of that to the bottom left of the screen. And we've already talked about that before. It's any labor that's not directly related to subsistence. So as there's more specialized labor, there can be more social stratification. I'm not sure if that's a term we've gotten yet. If we haven't, more or less it equates to hierarchy. It's a term that was borrowed from geology, stratification. There are different layers as you dig through the earth. You can see the different layers. If anyone's been through a canyon or dug a really deep hole, you can see the stratification. Anthropologists and sociologists lifted that term from geology and applied it to people, called it social stratification. Refers to a hierarchy. Jared Diamond saw this in itself as a problem because hierarchies lead to conflict. Conflict can lead to collapse. Organized warfare. is also directly related to specialized labor. It's not that there was no violence in hunting and gathering groups. There certainly was. There was small inter-party raiding that went on. We talked about that. When we talked about the Yanomamo. There was certainly violence. People solved problems through informal use of power. On the other hand, an organized war is a different thing. When you have an agricultural state that is backing a specialized class of people whose only job it is to go and fight wars, that leads to a different kind of warfare. And potentially, organized warfare could wipe out the entire human species, particularly in conjunction with technology later on. All right. Now, first looking at this list, I like to, when I'm in class, I like to ask a lot of questions about it, and usually we come around to the idea that we've solved most of these things, most of these issues. The overdependence on one crop, for example, if you go to a store, you're going to see all kinds of different things that we eat. We clearly are not dependent on one crop, so we don't have to worry about one crop just failing and everybody starving to death. In terms of population, density in cities, we've worked out sanitation systems so we can avoid a lot of those problems that were killing people early on. There's no river running through the middle of a city. Even if there is, a sewage system pipes the bad stuff in, out, and we have water systems that bring potable drinking water in. So we've presumably solved that problem. In terms of social stratification, we've figured out ways to work together in complex systems with high degrees of stratification without killing each other pretty much every day. Right? Every part of the world pretty much is run by states. States have social stratification in them. They have a high degree of specialized labor, so presumably we've conquered that one. Organized warfare, something that's still present, but we've had a long period of peace, probably the longest ever in humanity in our lifetimes. And so we may have sort of conquered that one through economic integration, or at least that was the narrative that has gone on through most of my lifetime. So we've made great strides in dealing with these issues. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a population as large as we have today. We've been very successful. Now, on the other hand, if we go back to the top of that list, we start really thinking about it. We still have a dependence on a small number of crops. If you go into a grocery store, for example, you may see a lot of different foods, but if you start looking at the major sources of calories that we take in, it really comes down to a few things. Right? Corn is in a lot of things, maybe things you wouldn't even think of. But think about the things that have high fructose corn syrup in them, in addition to the things that actually use corn as a starch. A lot of the calories that we take in come from the corn crop. Not to mention the fuel that we produce uses part ethanol. That's produced by corn. All of the meat section right, is fed by the products of planting, so a lot of that is fed by corn. So if we lost the corn crop, for example, that would make a major dent in our ability to produce food. We lose a lot of the food that we see in the grocery store, a lot of the plant-based foods, but we'd also lose most of the meat section. And we'd also have difficulties with transport because it would cut into our ability to produce fuel. So we're very dependent on that crop. You might say that we have other crops that we could then use to supplement if that was to disappear for some reason. Say there were some corn plague that killed all the corn. We could use rice or potatoes or something like that, but there'd be a major shift in production, and that would take probably decades, maybe generations to affect in the first place. And something could happen to that too. Whatever affected the corn might affect whatever you choose to switch to. But either way, it wouldn't happen overnight. Like even if you could switch to another crop entirely, or supplement with a couple of different ones, it would take a period of time for adjustment. During that period, there would be a high potential for chaos. Right? Social stratification certainly has not gone away. If anything, there's more stratification in the world than ever. And if we look at the conflicts that have happened since the development of the state, many of them have to do with social stratification. I also should mention that Jared Diamond, Marshall Solins as well, who's the other reading, they're pretty much socialists. They're definitely trained in Marxism. They're using Marxist theory in their work, and I believe politically they're socialists. And so they're going to be very focused on social stratification as a potential source of basically warfare and destruction. The whole philosophy of socialism is based on class conflict, and that's been morphed into a bunch of different things. In any case, he still sees social stratification as a major issue. Organized warfare is definitely an issue. That did not go away, and if anything, it got worse. We do have a long period of peace. Reference Steven Pinker's Better Angels or Nature, I think he called it. Big tome. It's about 600 to 800 pages long. It's very long. But in that book, he details all of the peaceful things that have happened over the last basically the last 1,000 years. He tracks our transition from a very violent society to a very peaceful one. And that transition certainly did happen in a way. On the other hand, the violence didn't go away. It's still there. And some people have argued against Pinker's thesis as well. Bottom line is, we still have massive nuclear stockpiles. We still have states that come into conflict with each other, and people come into conflict, states or no. But nuclear stockpiles, that's something people don't think about very much at this point. They really should. There's something called the doomsday clock, which has measured our proximity to total disaster ever since the Cold War. Excuse me, we usually talk about the Cold War in class too. Some people aren't that familiar with it. That was a period of time when the Western world was fighting against the communist world, and it wasn't that they were fighting in an actual war and shooting at each other, but they were politically maneuvering against each other, and the threat of nuclear war was there all the time. That threat didn't go away. Those nuclear arsenals are largely still in place, and there are enough nuclear warheads to turn the Earth into a flaming cinder, basically. And those things are more dangerous than ever, potentially, if they were to launch. I skipped over the diseases of affluence. Let's go back to that for a second. Those are things that are most likely to kill us today. Right, there are things like heart attacks, strokes, obesity, diabetes, things that are associated with having too much, right? Too many calories, not necessarily enough nutrition, but too many calories. And they are the things that are most likely to kill us. They don't kill us when we're young, they kill us when we're older generally. But diseases of affluence are things that didn't exist in the past that do exist now as a result of our success. Another thing that I've always talked about in here is the potential for pandemics. Now, under the circumstances, everybody's got pandemics on their mind, I suppose. I've been talking about pandemics in this portion of the lecture for probably 10 years or better. And usually I bring up zoonotic diseases, which are zoonotic, zoonotic disease, which is a disease that can hop from an animal population to a human population. And I usually talk about the influenza pandemic of 1918. I'm sure that some people have familiarized themselves with that at this point, given the circumstances in the world. Now, that was presumably a zoonotic disease. Influenza in general is categorized as such, and the connection here is that often the strains of influenza that get passed all around the world and create pandemics came out of farming practices. Right? They came out of either, you probably heard of bird flus or swine flus. They come out of chicken populations and pig populations, respectively. And often they're in, one was in Europe, often they're in Southeast Asia, where they have large farming complexes, like huge farming complexes that supply large portions of the world. And they do what they can to keep those animals alive and relatively healthy so that they can go to market. And sometimes it amounts to throwing fistfuls of antibiotics out into the feed pens and trying to prevent as much disease as they can. Now, on the other hand, because they have so many animals living in such cramped conditions and in such large numbers, it acts as sort of a petri dish for certain diseases like influenza that can hop from animal to human populations. It's just endemic in the population of chickens, let's say, at a big chicken farm. And that means it's there, it's infecting a certain number of animals at any given time, and goes through multiple mutations trying to stay alive, in opposition to the immune systems of the animals. So it serves as a giant petri dish for the development of viruses and bacteria. I mentioned antibiotics before. I should point out that antibiotics don't directly affect viruses. They affect bacteria. The effectiveness of those is another issue. We can't really get into all of that in this case, but they definitely don't affect viruses. So the influenza is a virus, and so antibiotics don't really control that at all. So there's a continually evolving endemic influenza, several strains of influenza that are in these populations of animals that we rely on for food. And every once in a while, one, because it's potentially zoonotic disease, it can hop from the animal population to a human population. And then we have outbreaks and potentially pandemics. A pandemic is when it spreads around the whole world, by the way. Keep using that term like you already know what it is. And maybe you do. Epidemic is when you have a regional outbreak. So if something's endemic, that means it's continually present in the population. That's endemic. If something's epidemic, then there's been an outbreak in a region. That's epidemic. If something's a pandemic, that means it's spread to multiple countries, presumably around the world. That's pandemic. We're currently in the middle of a pandemic. Now, it has been suggested that this is a zoonotic disease that hopped from a bat population to a human population by means of a bat soup that was purchased or eaten at a wet market in China. I've been to a wet market in China. They're highly unsanitary. I wouldn't recommend ever going to one. Is it possible that there are diseases that hop from animal populations to human populations? Yep, absolutely. That is absolutely a possibility. Beyond that, I can look at the facts, and anything more that I would say would probably be speculation. It is worth noting, however, there's a virology lab in the same town where the wet market was, and it's the only level 4 virology lab in China. That's an interesting point. That's probably as much as I can say about that, though. Yeah, as far as the actual source of the virus that we're dealing with right now, I don't know any more than anybody else, and probably will never really know what went on there. So it's still a possibility. It's just a naturally evolved zoonotic disease. Could have had something to do with research. I really don't know. But as I said, this is something I've talked about over and over again. One thing I can say about this, it probably is not related to farming practices that I usually talk about. Zoonotic diseases can come from wild populations, obviously, as well. One example of that is the Ebola outbreaks that we hear about in Africa, which are directly related to the consumption of bushmeat, which is wild meat that has not been domesticated. It's not a result of any farming practice. It's stuff that was killed in the jungle. In that case, it did come from bats as well. Right. So there is precedent for that. Excuse me. In the Ebola situation, it's a different kind of disease and it spreads differently, so it's much more difficult to spread than something like the influenza or coronavirus. Those can both aerosolize and spread through the air, through droplets in the air. Ebola, I understand, is transmitted through bodily fluids directly. You have to come into contact with them, so it's more difficult to spread. It also has a much higher death rate. Right, the chances that Ebola will kill you, I don't remember the exact number, but it's over 50%. And when a disease has a higher death rate, it's actually in some ways less threatening. It's worse if you get it, but it's not worse in terms of its pandemic potential, because it kills off the hosts, and when it kills off the hosts, then it's less likely to spread. Right? People avoid dead bodies. So the Ebola, while it's a much more virulent disease and it's much more terrifying in the way that it kills you, it's less likely to become a global pandemic. That said, anything can happen, I suppose. But that's about all I can say about the current situation. Right? We do still have a persistent threat of pandemic disease from farming practices. My understanding is this did not come from our farming practices. I probably can't say much more about it than that. There was one more reading. It was by Marshall Solins. It was titled "The Original Affluent Society," and I don't know how well people did with that. That was a more difficult piece, and we'll have to figure out some way to do questions. Maybe we'll do a discussion board on that one. I'll have to look into that. What I can say about it for now is that he was making basically a similar argument to the one that Jared Diamond was making. Right, Diamond's point was, this is the worst thing we ever did, was transitioning to intensive agriculture. Any of these things could go wrong at any time, and we could have a global collapse. Right, that was his point. Solons is making a similar argument by a different route. Right, he's making his argument. His piece was titled "The Original Affluent Society." He makes another comparison between agriculturalists and hunter-gatherers, and he compares their time usage. Right, so he actually looks at the economic anthropology underlying time use in hunter-gatherer populations, compares that to people in agricultural populations. And what he finds is very much along the lines of Diamond's argument. We have a more difficult life. He's not saying that we'll all, die or have a massive collapse of the system necessarily. But what he is saying is our quality of life has gone down, and hence his title, "The Original Affluent Society." It's meant to refer to the hunter-gatherers, not to us. We think of ourselves as affluent because we associate affluence with wealth, right? And he's saying if we adjust our thinking a little bit, and we think of affluence in terms of leisure time and quality of life rather than just wealth, then his point is hunter-gatherers were better off than us. And he actually works through the data and shows that they work much less than us. If you start thinking about how much time you have to put in just to get everything done in a week, it's an enormous amount of time. We work 40 hours, and we have to do dishes and laundry and clean the house and do car maintenance and pay the bills and go to the store and get food still, and there are a million things that we have to do. We end up working 60, 70, 80 hours a week just to do the basic things of life. He's saying that they fall between 20 and 30 hours a week, and the rest of the time they can relax, they can hang out with their family and friends, and also when they're working, they're with their family and friends all the time. So Solon's argument, although it was much more complex, maybe a little drier too, was very much along the lines of Jared Diamond's argument. Again, we may put together a discussion board that people can ask questions on. I'll look into that. That's the end of that one, though.